You said you've had experiences beyond the construct, and I'm so curious what exactly that means.
I developed this one pretty extreme protocol, and you drop out of consensus reality altogether. You can see in all directions at the same time. You can look at an incredibly complex, this really radiant golden object or organism I kind of saw. It felt like it was alive. There's this unitive field of consciousness. So it's like gnosis, right? It's like a direct knowledge from conscious experience, a conscious experience of an entity, an identity that's so much broader and deeper than Darren. Related to what we were discussing before with these ancient scriptural texts describing interactions between non-human beings and humanity at different phases. And what these generals were basically saying, and I've had some conversations with Carl Nell about this. Obviously, he's guarded about what he can say, but he will say that it's one thing when you think about this in an abstract way, but when you're presented with evidence that you know these things are real and they are like controlling things behind the scenes, that's a whole different matter. Wow. You know, he does feel this on his conscience. There's cases where someone will be recruited into the military and they are quickly tested for certain capacities, which they demonstrate that they do have. They are eventually taken to a certain elite group within the military. They're taken to these trailers, put on a headset, and tune in telepathically and receive coordinates that arrived in their mind. It's like latitude, longitude, dates, and times of when abductions were going to happen. And again, this would be another huge aspect of shock for disclosure. Not only knowing that the US government knew about abductions, but actually signed off on them.
Hey, welcome back to the Mind Meld, my friends. The mysteries of reality, the phenomenon, they never stop breaking the frame. Every time we try to pin reality down into some kind of neat little system, let alone a materialist one, something slips through the cracks, right? Psi phenomena, or synchronicity, altered states, telepathy, non-physical entity encounters. And that in part is why, as many of you know, I think it is time, past time, to admit that at large, we've got a problem with our view of reality, our ontology. And our guest in this one, Darren King, aka Exo Academian, host of the Liminal Phames podcast and the Point of Convergence podcast, he understands all of the above on a very deep level. As such, this Mind Meld goes straight off the high dive into the deep end of the pool. We riff on the centrality of consciousness, not only to the phenomenon, but to reality itself, why disclosure may be far stranger and more all-encompassing than most people imagine, and why some of the best, most novel clues about the phenomenon point not to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but to intelligences from a deeper psychical layer of reality. And this Mind Meld is about so many other things. What that more sophisticated worldview or ontology might look like. The importance of stepping outside of consensus reality. Suppressed human origins. Alleged psionic or psychical programs within the military and intelligence organizations. And honestly, so much more. This is one of my favorite Mind Melds in quite some time. Darren and I are absolutely philosophical, kindred spirits. So let's get into this one, my friends. But first, do make sure you are subscribed wherever you are listening. Review if you can do that. Like, comment, share, hype the thing on YouTube, and let's initiate this Mind Meld with Darren King. Darren, I am deeply looking forward to this conversation because, like we were just talking about, like we almost got lost in the conversational sauce before recording, you know, just bringing up so many similar interests, similar influences. So I'm really looking forward to this first and foremost. Before I continue blathering on, I'll say that.
Thanks. I mean, me too. It's always fascinating when you do touch base with people who have a similar passion, nearing obsession around these topics, and then you find all this common ground, not just similar like metaphysical positions that we kind of identified, but also similar things about our background. And it's all truly fascinating. And I'm sure this will be a really rich conversation.
Yeah. So those similar interests, just to let the audience know, you know, stem from your sort of philosophical predilections. Clearly, you're very interested in like idealist philosophy, thinkers like Don Hoffman, Bernardo Castro. I'm guessing Federico Fagin, though we haven't talked about him directly. But then also your take on the phenomenon in general is so similar to mine in so many ways that I could start listing off. But the first one that comes to mind is how I think mainstream metaphysics, like the mainstream view of reality, is just so ill equipped to try to grapple with how strange and multi faced and trickstery and broad it seems to be. So, the first thing I heard by you that really made me, by the way, want to invite you on the show is that most recent episode you put out, ironically. Um, it seemed like it came out at just the perfect time for me to hear it, for it to be, because we were both at South by Southwest, but the audience doesn't know we didn't get a chance to hang out. And then you had just put that episode out. So it was almost like the most synchronistically weird timing. Synchronistic in that we like just missed each other, yet somehow you had just put something out right when it needed to come out for this connection to occur. So yeah, maybe we could start by sort of summarizing your take in that episode.
Yeah, so I think that what I was addressing in that take in some ways was a summary of the entire point of my podcast. So the podcast is called, I have two podcasts, but that one is called Point of Convergence. And it's all about the convergence between ancient metaphysical traditions, experience that is, described in the UFO phenomenon and other anomalous kinds of experiences, as well as the most recent trends in different sciences. So different fields of inquiry are all kind of converging on this similar idea. And it's interesting because you really have to be taking the 30,000 foot view to see that that's happening. But if you have a broad enough perspective and you look to the future, you can see that even the mainstream is moving there slowly but surely. So what I
Yeah.
wanted to do in that episode was draw all these together and demonstrate how not only does the anomalous phenomena not become the outlier, but actually a bit of a tell of what ultimate reality might be more like, but also the fact that science is reluctantly, but nevertheless, it's getting there, and we're moving further and further from a physicalist tradition. I know that you have talked to Bernardo Kastrup, I have as well, and he would definitely make the point that he's noticed a big shift in the last 10 years in terms of how much idealism is tracking. And he finds that it's really difficult actually to find physicalist philosophers who can debate him in a legitimate way because the evidence is really not on that side. So I think people like him and you and I and people who, track with the stuff we're interested in recognize that we're kind of ahead of the curve. We're kind of the frontiers people, but inevitably, I think this is where society is going to have to come.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe we could get into some of the reasons why you need to look at something more like idealist philosophy and the kind of ontology or, the view of reality that it implies to even come close to potentially understanding the phenomenon and all of its permutations. Because I think what I often see, even amongst very intelligent people, is convenient cherry picking of certain kinds of weird shit, but then just leaving other things like either unaddressed or they just like completely dismiss it because it's not convenient for the way that they view reality and they view the phenomenon. And on one hand, yeah, you've got to be discerning, right? Like you've got to pick and choose like what does the preponderance of evidence seem to support in terms of what's really going on here, what could be delusion, what could be real experiences. But at the end of the day, I think you've got to have something pretty flexible and something that can really account for a wide array of experiences. And I think I'm sort of like maybe pulling the leash a little bit in a certain conversational direction, or just pulling it toward my own, uh, you know, preconceived notions. But yeah, let me ask you a more basic question. How did you start coming to the conclusion that you needed to look down these sorts of avenues to start to even begin to explain the phenomenon?
That's a great question. And it's interesting because, as I often say, as you live more life, it tends to recontextualize your past. And so looking back, I see a very noticeable march towards this that began a long, long time ago. Um, I think that first of all, I would say that my background involves studying integral theory and Ken Wilber's material, and he really helped me to initially recognize that we needed to set a place at the table for these ancient metaphysical traditions, these ancient wisdom traditions that seemed to again be ahead of the curve in terms of where science was going. But what he really made a compelling argument for was that these can be mutually um, informing kind of aspects of reality, different domains of knowledge which can work together them rather than being either or, being absolute in terms of what we choose. So that already helped me because I before then had been kind of a spiritual person and had spiritual experiences, but then also went to a standard Western college and was kind of, draped in physicalism and materialism and the reductionistic aspect of all that. And so I didn't really know how to make sense of that because the spiritual circles I was in tended to be kind of uneducated, and really just didn't even want to deal with what science was saying. And
Hmm.
yet, what I saw Wilbur doing was saying, "Let's take everything that science is saying. Let's take everything that psychology is saying, right? Let's look at how some of these ancient gurus or even modern gurus can have deeply penetrating insights into underlying reality that is sort of prior to the physical expression, but still might have ethical problems, like they're sleeping with their students and they're taking people's
Yeah,
money. That just because you have a deep awareness or intelligence in one kind doesn't mean you're across the board going to be an intelligent person or well-developed person. So he kind of recognized that, there's some shadow work that some guru figures need to do, right? Like these things can
totally.
work together, right? So that was a big part of my background. And then as I had my own experiences and initially didn't know what to do with them, again, it's so fascinating when you look back because even the person that is now my ex-wife, that we're still good friends, when I look back at how we came together, there's just so many synchronicities, how we even came together. We were on different parts of the continent, and together it seemed to create this kind of alchemical stew where we seemed
Hmm.
to have all these synchronistic, really bizarre paranormal experiences, which seemed to be somehow being set off alchemically by our interaction, which right
Yeah.
away made me go, what does that say about reality? And then I had some experiences with her that we just didn't know what to do with. So you kind of put it on the back burner because physicalism doesn't have any way of making sense of it. And then much later on, I came across or sort of got back into the UFO phenomenon and started recognizing how common some of our experiences were within what we generally call the UFO phenomenon. And then when you start coming across all the high strangeness, all the parallels with deeper traditions, with fairy lore and all these things, and ancient scriptural traditions and the entities they describe, and part of my background is doing a religious studies degree, so I remember studying that in college, but being told that you have two options. Either it's like literally real, that these are gods coming down from heaven, or these are stories that people made up that were
Right.
pre-scientific to try to make sense of why their crops burned one year. There was no third or fourth option given, basically. So then what happened was, I remember noticing that it was kind of the Wild West in the UFO community, trying to make sense of these things. People are saying ET is too simple, maybe interdimensional, but even interdimensional kind of arises out of physicalism in a way, like multiple physical universes in a multiverse. Some
It
people were
could.
talking
Yeah.
about, yeah, ultra terrestrials. So then what I did was I said, I wonder if there's anything going on in different fields of science that might speak to this. And that's when I came across Nima Arkani Hamed's work as a
Mm.
physicist. I came across Donald Hoffman's work in cognitive neuroscience and sort of recognizing, wait a second, like this is all speaking to this. And then at some point, you have this aha moment where you go from thinking there's a world external to you, which you can observe and study independently from your consciousness, and instead flip it around and go, what if the world is rendering out of my consciousness and my consciousness is just a partitioned aspect of a much larger consciousness? Once I started looking at it that way, that made sense of my integral history, made sense of my spiritual history, made sense of where science was going, and created a host network that could work with all the phenomena coming out of the UFOs and NHI.
Yeah, man, you're speaking my language on so many levels, and I'm tempted. There's so many threads I'm tempted to pull on. One of the thread, I'm just going to go with what's coming to mind right now. You started to touch on personal experiences that really made you confront the reality that physicalism cannot be the full story or the story at all. Some of these synchronicities, but I've heard you allude to something in the podcast that I wanted to ask you about at some point, which is you said you've had experiences. Maybe this needs more foreplay before you want to get into this because we're only 10 minutes in, but I'm just going to plunk it out there anyway. You said you've had experiences beyond the construct, and I'm so curious what exactly that means and how you arrived at those experiences.
Yeah, that becomes fascinating in itself because on the one hand, you sometimes usually are brought into these circles because you've had some experience happen to you. It doesn't feel like something you chose. And then usually people are thrown for a loop and they have to scramble to try to make sense of this. And it's only usually then that people begin to look at what could this mean for reality. So that happened to me initially, right? My initial experiences were things that happened to me that made me open up my mind to consider reality differently. But then I came to a place where I was thinking, I want to really sort of take the front foot. I want to choose to work with reality, to explore reality in ways that I can sort of fill out this model more. So I did a bunch of research and I developed this one pretty extreme protocol, which I quite purposefully don't describe the details of
Hmm.
or the ingredients of, because I just know it could be psychologically and physically dangerous for people if they didn't do it properly. Takes place over like 3 days. And, it's quite the shift coming back. I can talk in a minute about something that I experienced coming back that kind of humorously describes what that's like. So basically, this combination of aspects that are part of this protocol, when I use it, it's really extreme and you drop out of consensus reality altogether.
Hmm.
But what's fascinating is that you don't have any disruption in your sense of I amness. So there's not like there's a gap and then suddenly you're something else. It's like, but what it's more like is like there's this partition of what you usually experience yourself as, which is fairly narrow. You don't realize it's narrow until you suddenly have more context. But when I drop out of the construct, I am then in a experience where suddenly I feel 100 times more expansive than that.
Hmm.
And there's many ways that comes in. You start, it's really interesting because when you're someone who's thoughtful about these things, you're both having the experience and you're analyzing the experience at the same time, right? So things like you can see in all directions at the same time. You can look at an incredibly complex object like this really radiant golden object or organism. I kind of saw it, felt like it was alive. But with our
And was this
usual,
something that you were physically looking at, or was this like a mind's eye, like
definitely
psychical
mind's eye.
experience?
Like,
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
my
yeah,
eyes are closed when this is happening, right? You do not have the capacity to be walking around when you're under this kind of protocol.
yeah.
Um, and but what you're seeing is fascinating because you're noticing that unlike here, where we tend to only have focus where we're looking, right? So we don't usually realize it, but all of our peripheral vision is actually pretty blurry. It's only directly where we're looking where we're getting
Right.
the focus, right? But in that experience, it wasn't relying on any kind of physical architecture or or physiology in general. So I could see in all directions with absolute fidelity, and every direction you looked had incredibly granular detail, and it felt completely natural, right? And then also things that would happen would be memories that would come in that made it clear to me that in our usual experience, our waking state experience, we're partitioned, right? I call these constraints. So we are under a series of constraints that, I think they're purposeful. I think that again, from a perspective of the non-dual traditions, you have to have differentiate in order to have any differentiation, you have to take a perspective, right? And so in order to have this particular incarnational experience, you have to take on a set of constraints. So each of us has chosen the human experience. I think that's what's going on. But from there, right? So space time, again, even from science, we understand from Nima Arkani Hamed will tell you that the math itself, it will not lie to you. It's very clear there are structures deeper than space-time, prior to space-time. Space-time is an epiphenomenon of these deeper processes.
Yeah.
So that's a key distinction because once you recognize that, you no longer go around looking at these so-called anomalous data, these outliers, and want to square them with space-time because you don't need to because space-time is an epiphenomenon. So what you want to do is look at them and ask, what are they telling us about the deeper nature of reality? Why is psi real? How do NDEs happen? Why is telepathic contact so common with experiences of the phenomenon? On it goes. And really it comes down to, again, not only is this my perspective from everything I've read and resonated with, but from my own personal experience in these outside the construct experiences, it's because there's this unitive field of consciousness. And you're much closer to that. And what's strange is when the constraints are no longer there, then these, you experientially tap into as memories. And you have memories from myriad different worldscapes. And you remember all of them. And it's really interesting. The way I describe it is that here we're used to communicating in a really clunky way with language, one word after
Yeah.
another, and they're just like symbols, and it's super clunky actually. But in that experience, it's more like clusters of knowledge come in, and you'll think about one thing and you'll suddenly have access to like 5 million data points that relate to that somehow. Almost the way that
Mm,
AI really in a complex way, in a multidimensional way, can store not just information, but relationships between all those different pieces of data. So that's kind of what happened to me. And then when you come back, I always want to point this out because this was probably the most profound experience, was the coming back. And it's almost like, the way I describe it is that you're used to running your computer, and sometimes you put it to sleep, but you don't ever really shut it off. And then one day, you have a power outage and your computer shuts down. And when it boots up, then you start seeing these root processes coming online that you don't usually ever notice. They're usually up and running from the second you open up your computer. So that became my experience of this construct, that I was
mm,
seeing things boot up, like really base level elements that were booting up that are like prior to the rendering of the program.
yeah.
And it's really hard to describe with our language, but basically what it comes down to is, it wasn't just that I knew this was not foundational the way that we're taught it is, but I knew that from a structural point of view. So it's like gnosis, right? It's like a
Hmm.
direct knowledge from conscious experience, but something that's a conscious experience of an entity, an identity that's so much broader and deeper than Darren. Darren was some like way downstream little refraction over here
Yeah.
of this really, this massive expansive thing. So it really did like fundamentally change. First of all, it definitely affirmed the things I was already thinking, and the metaphysical directions I was leaning. But having that experience, there's nothing like it. Like, you just cannot compare it to anything else. And even when it comes to the way that we often are driven by fear here, for instance, when I came back, I made a pact. I refuse to be motivated by fear, because I know this is a dreamscape. It's
Yeah.
meaningful, it's purposeful, but it's one of myriad numbers of reality scapes from an identity that really defines what I am, which is outside any kind of instantiation or manifestation, and is therefore indestructible. So you look at it like this adventure we're on, that there's really no downside. And it makes you even want to not check out and say, well, this is not really real, so I'm just going to skate through life. Instead, you want to really deeply live. You want to feel everything as much as you can, like in a maximal way. So that was the experience when I described being outside the construct.
Friends, I have been doubling down on content over in the YouTube members section and on Patreon. So if you desire further novelty, point your qualia in said directions. If you do join up at patreon.com/third eye drops, you will also get access to a patron only Discord and other rewards. Or if you just want that content, flip over to the member section here on YouTube and become an initiate. So much love for supporting. And back to the Mind Meld. So well articulated, and that really resonates with my own sort of most impactful experiences as well. And I won't push you too hard on the protocols, but I think, even if you just take some of the obvious options, right? Or you take the most basic advice from, mystics going back as far as you want. There's usually a similar subset of ingredients you can play with, right? It's you've got to do some kind of purification. You've got to do some kind of separating yourself from the outside world for probably an extended period of time. Some kind of deep meditation, potentially augmented with some molecular aids, perhaps. Um, and even if we just keep it at that, that's a pretty powerful cocktail. And I mean, you can go to crazy deep levels with it. Like I have friends who have done 6-7 day complete darkness retreats plus some of those other things. So I mean, like the levels you can go to, they may sound basic, but one, it's it doesn't feel basic when you're doing it. You know, like just because it's not the most novel thing you've ever heard before, the experiences in and of themselves are incredibly novel, and they are so far outside of the everyday sort of consensus reality, frontal lobe, default mode network kinds of reality that we're used to living in. And man, what you said about the 360 vision was really, really interesting because I'm sure you've come across this too. Some of the Neoplatonic mystics, in particular, talk about this idea of the eye of the soul or the soul sense, and they sort of describe it like when the psyche gets a body or inhabits a body or descends into a body. If you follow the Platinian sort of Plotinus view of soul fall, it's almost like it distributes itself across the physical husk and divides itself into the five senses. But really, there's one sense, and it's this soul sense. And upon liberating the soul vehicle from the body, you sort of remember that there's this one more basic primordial sense that all of the other senses sort of are, very diluted versions of, or something like that. And it's every kind of perception all at the same time, or something, and it's very overwhelming and very visceral when you first cross into that um threshold. And also, apparently, like when you die, this is what happens. Did I say that already?
No.
Like if you there's a I forget the name of it, but there is a tale of cosmic ascent by Proclus, the Middle Platonist, where it's this whole story about a guy. His name is on the tip of my tongue, but anyway, he's sort of this ne'er do well guy who runs afoul of basically everyone in his life, and he goes to an oracle to try to figure out how he can like improve his reputation or something. And the oracle basically tells him, "You'll do better in death." So he's just like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm doomed to this." And then shortly after that, he has a like catastrophic fall where he like really messes himself up, and he goes out of body and he starts going through the death process. And he describes the sense that he's perceiving with in the exact same way, this sort of 360 vision, and these higher realms sort of like slowly reveal themselves as he gets further and further from his physical incarnation. And I won't get into it, but it's a very, very fascinating tale, and I'll definitely put a graphic up or the title up or whatever, because I can't conjure it. But yeah, it's always intriguing, right? When your own experience overlaps with the world's mystical traditions, and those ideas go from an interesting sort of artifact or possibility to, no, holy shit, that is 100% real, and now I have personal verification of that. And man, it's like having this conversation right now. I'm like lusting after one of those experiences. Yet every single time I get one, it's always so ontologically disruptive, and it's never easy. Like these experiences are never easy or like super rosy, at least not in my case. Um, so I do have to be careful of tempering my expectations for that. But yeah, do you want to add anything on the conversation about protocols, or the way that I described any of that before we move on?
Yeah, well, I would say that a couple things that I think really fascinating and telling as well. And one is that, on the one hand, people would wonder, why would these ancient adepts from 5,000 years ago be able to learn things about reality? This was
Yes.
pre-scientific. They didn't have any of our modern devices or tools, or even conceptions of analysis. But of course, the reason why they were able to is because consciousness is primary, and because they actually had much fewer distractions than we do, and because they hadn't bought into this fairy tale that physicalism adequately describes reality, they explored from within. And as we are finding in a really fascinating way, we come to similar conclusions, whether you explore the outer reaches of the cosmos, or the most fundamental aspects of what seems like physical reality at the quantum level. And you take what you learned there and what these guys learned by just going on this inward journey and keep following it, keep following it, keep following it, you come to the same place, which is fascinating. And that in itself, I think, is a really good argument for why consciousness is primary. The other thing I think that's really interesting is that we can do things, and this is being happening more and more now with experiments that are being done where you disrupt in the frontal lobe the neurochemical activity of the frontal lobe. And as you do that, people become more psychic pretty much
Mm,
across the board, right? More
mm,
intuitive, more psychic. So this seems to suggest not only that our consciousness is not being produced by the brain, but it's actually more like a reducing valve that again is partitioning what comes in, right? And then you might have on top of that, as Don Hoffman would point out, this kind of interface aspect where you're actually not only dumbing down, but you're recreating icons to work with rather than what actually is going on. And I think when you go outside of this interface, you very much see it that way as an interface. So I think that's what's fascinating is that as much as the world feels incoherent and overwhelming for many people right now, and it feels like it's not going in a good direction, I think something I hold out some hope for is that as we make it more mainstream for people to explore outside the construct, as I would say, or outside the default mode network, they will come across aspects of themselves, right, that are part of reality. They will lose this distinction between the subject and the object, and
yeah.
the separation. It will be exposed as an illusion, and then even the most, in some ways, hardened, supremacist or narcissist might think twice after having that experience. So I'm hoping that happens more, and as it becomes more mainstream in our culture, that will happen. But absolutely, once you've had these experiences, once you've done the research, you come to a certain point, as you and I both have, where it's not really a question anymore. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming, and then it's just a matter of how long are we going to take as a culture to get over some of our biases.
Yeah. Get over just being acting out physical neuroses of the world soul, like those people that you just described that are very like ensconced in a certain way of thinking. It almost feels like they're like physical manifestations of some neuroses of the collective unconscious that haven't like figured out how to work themselves out yet or something. But speaking of the collective unconscious, one of the things we were talking about right at the beginning is how we're sort of ill-equipped, at least at large, as a society to have a metaphysical imagination big enough to account for not only the phenomena and UFOs and stuff like that, but even things beyond that, right? And again, this is one of the reasons I'm so influenced by the Neoplatonists. I think they like particularly some of these thinkers like Iamblichus and Proclus who went extremely, extremely deep into. It's interesting because I have a love hate with like these super technical, complex hierarchies of being, but I also feel like they're onto something when you look at these things. So for people that aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, again, I'll flash an example up where you essentially have these um, most basic causative powers at the very top. So it varies among the Neoplatonists, but it's always the one. It's always some version of Tohen, the one. And Tohen or the one is sort of overflowing in its I don't know, hyparxis or its power or something. And it naturally leads to these other manifestations below itself until you get down to physical reality, which is essentially and this would comport with thinkers like Don Hoffman, which is essentially like the lowest ontological layer of reality is when you get to these physical manifestations. So, why why do we need something like that, in your opinion, to account for the phenomenon? And are you a fan of those kinds of metaphysical pictures, or are you, or is it too complex and noodly for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. On the one hand, I am interested in them. I also would make the point that just like when you are map making, right, when you take a geographic area and you want to map it out, first of all, you don't want to do a one to one representation of the geography because the whole point is it's supposed to be iconic and simplified and
Mm,
symbolic in a way so that you can easily look at what you need to and then navigate. So to some degree, I would say that any kind of map making we do, including metaphysical map making, is going to be arbitrary to some extent. Like when you are mapping the shoreline, for instance, you can get more and more granular about what you're actually including. And at some point, it's not even useful though. So one thing that became clear to me again in my experiences is that you can, because you are an aspect of the one, right? This is what's so interesting about this. Again, even from a scientific point of view, you think about David Bohm and Pribram
Yeah.
and different people who came to similar
Yeah.
conclusions, where there's this like hologram like nature of reality, where we are not just a sliver of source, we actually are an instantiation of source, right? We're like a fractal aspect of source. And so that's again why I think the Gnostics had it right in the sense that you can tap into the oneness as an aspect of the oneness, right? So then I think how we make sense of how the outflow happens from that, right? So in again, back in my Wilberian background, we used to talk about evolution and involution. So evolution is the drawing back into the one. Evolution actually moves in that direction. And you can certainly make that case scientifically. You
Yeah.
can make that case even sociologically, that over time, our sense of self and our sense of what we should protect, like human rights, animal rights, earth rights, they tend to expand as long as you don't have some sort of massive war or something. And then sometimes you get regression. But overarchingly, just reality itself eventually teaches you somehow all of this must be connected and you start protecting it, right? And you start enshrining that in law. And so you have that evolution back to the one. And then involution is the spilling out into the myriad forms.
Mm.
And each of these traditions, as you well know, kind of describe the same process, and sometimes where the differentiation is just subtle differences in terms of where they want to put the marks on the belt or whatever when they're sort of like measuring this all. So I do find it helpful, and I have some of my own senses of that. I think one of the really compelling aspects that completely does away with the fear of death. And when you talked about, the sort of world space neuroses, the taboo around death in our culture is a huge one,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When you see it as a liberation, what a different culture we would have, what a different way we would make sense of medicine and all those kind of things. But because of those experiences, I recognize that I myself am distributed across different levels of reality. And so you can again fall into the habit of trying to look outside yourself and say, these are the levels. But in another very real way, you are the levels, right?
Yeah.
Distributed across this. And so I do find those things helpful. Some I sort of lean on more than others. And I think whatever people find helpful to sort of scaffold it out, recognizing that really it's a gradient and it just comes down to granularity.
Yeah, that mystery of the many being in the one and the one being in the many is one of those things that is like such a psychedelic mind fuck to try to wrap your head around. And I don't think we can clearly at all because it's like the highest mystery. And that was actually taboo among a lot of these Neoplatonists is like basically, yes, you try to expand your mind, your psyche to these higher levels. But then when it comes to the one, you basically never try to say anything about it because, like, once you say something about the one, you're conditioning the one and you're trying to say that it is something when it can't be because it's everything and it's nothing and it's like this paradoxical thing. Um,
The Tao
but
that can
yeah,
be spoken is not the true Tao.
100%, 100%. And the something I read recently from Gregory Shaw, who wrote Theurgy and the Soul and Hellenic Tantra, and I don't remember if this is his quote or if it's Iamblichus's quote or another one of these theurgic Neoplatonists, but it was something to the effect of the one reveals itself through the many, or the one knows itself through the many, or it's something. It's one of those two, and that's one of those moments that sort of sent shockwaves through me because it feels so instinctually true. Yet again, it's so difficult to wrap your mind around how that can be. That there's something that has such infinite ever transforming fractaling potential that it can keep instantiating itself and renewing itself in new ways all the time, yet it still follows these weird cyclical archetypal patterns and um Yeah, it's unbelievable how mysterious it gets when you get to that level. And one of the aspects of the conversation from earlier too, I want to kind of reflect on is that this starts to sound very simulation like, right? It starts to sound very much like when we're talking about a construct or a desktop, like Don Hoffman uses that metaphor often. It starts to, I mean, it sounds exactly like that's what we're talking about. But I think there are some really key distinctions between mainstream simulation theory and what we're talking about. And instead of me blabbering on about it, I think you would probably do a better job of summarizing some of those things anyway. And plus, that was the panel that you were just on South by, so I know you're probably thinking along these lines already.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was looking forward to that because, like, I'm friend with Rizvirk, and Rizvirk wrote the simulation hypothesis. He wrote the book on the simulation
Yeah,
hypothesis, literally, um, and then he wrote a follow up called the simulated. What's it called? The multiverse, I think it is.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it's
I'll be
interesting. And
talking to him too soon, actually. Yeah,
okay, very cool. Yeah,
yeah,
and on the one hand, he and I had a lot of common ground in what we were talking about in that panel at South by Southwest. But I also, I think, go to a different place ultimately than he does. And I'm writing this book right now, and I actually have a chapter on why this is not a computer simulation,
yeah.
right? And because I think that there are many aspects of, as we've developed virtual worlds of our own and they've become more and more immersive, it's helped us to understand and ask the question, could this itself be? And I think even for younger generations that are used to being in these immersive headset kind of games, right, where you
Hmm.
move and everywhere shifts with the orientation, it's much easier for them to ask if this is also some sort of like virtual world. But I would look at it like, and again, I really want to emphasize, because in Western culture, we're so used to thinking that knowledge is cerebral and mostly left brain oriented, right? I love Ian McGilchrist's work and his, not just his recognition of the difference between the right and the left brain. You and I touched base on the fact that, interestingly, I use my left hand for a lot of things. I am function
Mm.
specific both handed. You are left handed, right? So
Yes, I am. Yeah.
it changes the way reality renders. Now, and again, this is a key point. Some people might say, "Oh, you mean you just notice different things?" And it's like, no, the world is not out there separate from you. You are rendering the world. So the world that you and I are rendering is different than a lot of people. And that, you start noticing again when you pay attention to Gary Nolan's research and the disproportionate kinds of genetic substrates that are related to anomalous experience and anomalous cognition is really fascinating. Um, but when I think about how is being rendered, when I had that more expansive understanding of myself, what ends up happening, and it's really, really bizarre. It's so profound. Like when I came out of the experience, for instance, I went to switch on a light switch and suddenly had this flood of awareness around why light was chosen as a particular configuration of constraint within an
Mm.
experience set. Like that, I remembered it as if it was me authoring that. And I had many other experiences like that as well, including why the human physiology was chosen as a particular configuration of how consciousness would manifest itself and the kind
Mm.
of world space it would create. So, in that sense, I would suggest that consciousness, of course, being primary, we're both on that same page from this kind of idealistic kind of point of view, or cosmopsychism, or whatever you want to say, that we set up the simulation, right? It's a constraining that we do. And speaking to what you said a few minutes ago about one perspective is that all of these worlds exist because this is how source explores itself. And you can make the argument, as some non-dual traditions do, that when you have this rich pure awareness, this field of pure awareness, you have infinite potentiality, but you also have nothing manifest. And so you actually have to take a perspective, which is to say, purposely limit yourself so that anything can emerge in differentiation, right?
Yeah.
And this is something, as you know, that the non-dual traditions go on about, that from our perspective in this dualistic world, we only experience things in contrast to other things, light and dark, cold and hot, and all these things. So what I recognized was not just that it made sense to me, right, that consciousness itself causes these different manifestations, these different instantiations of configurations of consciousness. But I remembered being part of that process. And this is where it becomes fascinating because, again, speaking of the sort of cultural taboos, so many people right in the West are going, do you think reincarnation could be real? Like, do you think I'm going to come back? And they're wondering if they're going to be the same or whatever. Number one, they forget or overlook or have never been taught that, the Eastern perspective is that you want to transcend the wheel of karma. You
Yeah.
don't want to have to come back. You want to go into a
Hmm.
more expansive kind of consciousness experience. Um, but that ultimately, these are just those. These are aspects of the self. And becomes really interesting even when we think about how consciousness manifests. So for some people, they will say, I had a sense of guidance. And it has some semblance of there's something else or someone else. Other people feel that more as it's a more expansive aspect of myself. Some people literally see a being. I would say that within this particular constraining of consciousness, when there's even kind of maintenance being done from a higher level, which again is still us, that sometimes it has to manifest as something. It has to take some configuration within the experience set that we have available here. But whether you look at it as a more expansive aspect of yourself, whether you look at it as you're part of some oversoul that involves other people too,
Yeah.
again, you have this gradient that goes all the way back to original consciousness. So from my perspective, and this is something I did really wrestle with, because the more I looked into it, and part of my background is as a software engineer,
Hmm.
and as Rizverk also pointed out, there sure are elements that look like the same sort of tactics we use in software engineering,
Yeah.
where it's real enough to be experienceable, but when you look really closely, there's nothing really there, right? And you can find the boundary, right? You can find the boundaries of the experience, which seems to suggest it is virtual. Again, I would say it is virtual, but ultimately the design or the implementation of that is arising in consciousness itself. And not surprisingly, because of fractals, as we develop these virtual worlds, as we develop AI, we begin to instantiate some of our own aspects of virtual
Yeah.
reality. And the kind of thing, it's all fractals all the way up and all the way down.
It absolutely is. And yeah, again, embarrassment of riches in terms of where I could go with this. But before we leave behind the simulation conversation, for me, I'm actually okay with saying yes, I think this is a simulation with the major caveat of it's a consciousness simulation. It's not like a digital computer simulation at bottom. Even though I agree, I do think that there are very information like structures that seem to clearly be built into reality. I actually saw somebody it's a random video. It was like a YouTube short the other day that wound up being a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be. But the hook was something like, I'm going to prove to you God exists in 2 or 3 minutes. And I was like, okay, this should be interesting. So essentially, he does a bunch of geometry with the size of the Earth relative to the size of the moon, the orientation of the Earth and the moon. And there, I mean, we could go down an hour-long rabbit hole about how much strange shit there is when it comes to Earth's moon. But basically, he shows that the Earth, the moon, and the sun, I believe it is. If it's not the
Yeah.
Earth, the moon, and the sun, it's the entire something about the entire solar system. Perfectly aligns with a sort of golden ratio kind of orientation, and things like that, where we could sit here and quibble about, okay, is it really evidence of God or is it evidence of there being uh, order and self-organizing properties and intelligence that just inherently manifests itself in reality. Whatever it is, there's something beyond pure randomness, right? So I think it's things like that that lead me to believe, yes, clearly there are sort of these rules that cannot be random, that you can see on display, even if you're looking back, and Don Hoffman would just say, if we're talking about things like the Big Bang, we're just looking through the headset, right? We're just looking at how creation appears through this very low ontological level. And it's probably not even worth doing. But even if you do that, you have to you start running up against these terms like fine tuning, and like why the universe was able to heat and cool and organize itself, and have just the right array of you know chemistry and all these different things that needed to not just collapse in on itself and fail. And then you have to sidestep that. You have to try to start getting into multiverse theory and blah blah blah. But anyway, adding up a bunch of circumstantial evidence like that is good enough for me to say that yes, there's definitely information, self-organizing, intention on some level, on very kind of low level, root level layers of reality. That's it, to me, it just seems to be self-evident. So in that way, I'm totally on board with simulation, but I don't think you can boil down the lowest level of reality to something like a computer simulation or digital information. I think it has to be consciousness.
Right. I totally agree. And I would say a couple things about this. Number one, speaking of the fine tuning, right? As Bernardo likes to point out, and his voice gets kind of high when he high pitched when he starts talking about this. Um, he would point out that the whole idea of the multiverse and many different universes is to try to explain away the strangeness, the
Yes.
uncanny nature of the
Yes.
fine tuning. And then he will also say, but there's absolutely zero evidence,
Yeah.
for these different universes, right? So it's basically a God of the gaps argument. Really, it's a leap to try to make sense of it. It's not the most parsimonious answer. I totally also agree with you that there does seem to be an information based aspect to this, and I look at it like a rule set that's waiting to be executed. And but I would point out that because this is consciousness doing this, the whole point is to make it experienceable, not to make it so real that no matter how granular your analysis is, it'll always come out as looking real. It's we're actually finding the boundaries, which is fascinating in itself. But as Bernardo would also like to point out, information always has to be information about something. So
Yeah.
when some people want to say, well, maybe this just the information is the bottom foundation, and he would say, well, it doesn't make any sense. Information is always about something. So I would say that along with you there, pure awareness is the fundamental aspect, and from that these informationally based rule sets are set up so that experience can constrain itself within a certain experience set and have novel experience, because that's the other aspect of the non-dual teaching, according to some of the traditions anyway, is that the only way you produce novel experience is by constraining consciousness and taking on a particular vantage point. And the whole point, and this is something that Tom Campbell will point out as well,
Hmm.
is that eventually that information all bubbles up because it's all an illusion of separation. So
Hmm.
whatever you learn, whatever I learn, whatever our ancestors learn, whatever a great alien learns, all bubbles up into source awareness, right? And this is how it understands itself. So the other aspect that Tom Campbell has pointed out, I remember he's been on a couple podcasts, and this, you know, this sense, this assumption that there must be physical reality. And if it's not here, it must be somewhere else. That's largely what I think leads to the notion, okay, maybe this is a computer simulation run in some alien world that's actually the physical reality.
Yeah.
Whereas Campbell would say, again, he also, stumbled across this because he realized he was really good at having OBEs, and he used it to explore and develop this more expansive understanding of physics. And when he's asked, okay, so are there other physical realities? And this concurs with the non-dual traditions. He's like, no, there are no physical realities, period. Right? The physicality is an aspect of the experience set. It renders as that. And you can experientially transcend that and prove it to yourself. So it is definitely simulation like. I like to use that term, but the only problem with the term simulation a little bit is that you think about the definition, right? Simulation means like a facsimile of something else.
Yeah.
But there is no other physical reality. This is actually being based upon. All manifestation is virtual. All manifestation is ultimately like a dreamscape within the mind of God or mind at large, right? So once you make that switch, and it's tricky to make that switch because we've been taught the opposite our entire lives, but once you make it, everything begins to make a whole lot more sense.
Absolutely. And I was just smirking there because I was hearing Tom Campbell's voice saying, it's a virtual reality within the larger consciousness system. As I just kept hearing that. But yeah, I completely agree with that take, and that's where I gravitate toward intellectually as well. And so now that we've gone out into this further flung metaphysical territory, and we circle back on the initial question of the phenomenon, you can see how what we've just outlined allows for so much more than physical space aliens that went, got in a ship for a really long time or went really, really fast and went from this planet to our planet. And yes, sounds like I'm totally straw manning it or totally dismissing it. Could be a possibility. I just don't find it to be the most parsimonious possibility, particularly when you can have an entity encounter just by perturbing the way that you interact with reality through something like DMT or breathing practices or a number of the other protocols we briefly mentioned. Like, that is not an uncommon experience for people to have. And of course, we diminish those experiences by and large in today's culture. But the experiences are there to be had, and they're very realistic when they do happen to you. So we'll just leave it at that. So given that, how then do you think about the types of entities that people experience in phenomenon like um, ways? Do you typically go for one thinker's explanation over another? Are you a fan of Jacques Vallée? Are you a fan of Keel? Do you prefer to appeal to some of these older ways of thinking that we've already been talking about? Who do you think gets the closest, or what have you sort of cobbled together as your sense making aperture on this matter of phenomena and entity encounters?
Right. I would definitely say a cobbling together of my own perspective, drawing from the smorgasbord of different thinkers over time, would be the closest explanation of where I end up. It's interesting because, again, I've been, as I was saying to you before we started recording, I've been privileged to be invited to some meetings where some different UFO organizations, different academics, different independent researchers, different journalists are coming together to see if we can find common ground and how to lobby for disclosure in the public sphere. And what becomes fascinating is you have all these different worldviews in the room. And I knew going in we were going to have this problem, but the people that organized it didn't necessarily know that. And so we end up stuck at like the ground floor. We never get up to even the first floor in the elevator because you're still arguing around or debating around what does a term mean and what are the constraints of reality, what is even in the possibility space. And you had some organizations there that are basically saying, well, these must clearly be space aliens. That's the only option on the table. That's the final frontier we haven't explored. So, let's look at radar returns and let's do energy analysis on how they're doing this and how they're propulsing themselves. But then it's really interesting. Even there, I've had many conversations with Kevin Canute, for instance, and
Mm.
and he says it to me one time as if it's going to be a shock to me. He's like, "I have to tell you, I don't think space time's foundational." And I said, "You don't say." I have a similar perspective, right? But he's saying that as a mainstream physicist, right? And studying the phenomenon. Another really interesting experience I had, though, one time I was in a meeting with another experiencer and Jeff Kripal, and I brought up this experience a friend of mine had where, and this is always fascinating, and it again speaks to the way that these things do overlap and intersect. This friend of mine that is a Buddhist practitioner had no interest in UFOs or the phenomenon, was not her thing at all, but she was kind of going through a difficult moments in life and kind of wanted a spiritual awakening or a boost of sorts. So
Hmm.
she arranged to go to Peru and do an ayahuasca ceremony with a traditional shaman.
Mm.
And to her surprise, after the third cup of the ayahuasca, she found herself on board a UFO, communicating with aliens that, on top of that, seemed to know her. She seemed to somehow know that they were familiar. They seemed happy that she'd found a way, one of many ways to communicate with them. And the other experiencer in the room when I was telling Jeff about this, Jeff Kripal, was this experiencer who has been someone that John Mack worked with that's a quote unquote physical abductee, right? In other words, she was taken from her house up into a craft. But even she will admit that sometimes they take your body, sometimes
Yeah.
they leave your body in bed and they just take your consciousness, right? What does that say about the nature of reality? And fundamentally, she didn't really like the idea of us lumping these together. right? Jeff also has a very expansive way of seeing this as all really speaking to the nature of reality. And these are not actually different categories. They might seem that way. And so it's interesting because, from her perspective, and someone who went through, understandably, the trauma she went through in the 90s where people were mocking her, and she gravitated towards John Mack because he was someone from the mainstream with credibility who was saying this must be real. We must have to,
Hmm.
we need
Hmm.
to look deeper at what reality is. But for her, she wants the mainstream, right? Meaning government, basically, and scientists and academia to say, we're sorry, you were right. It was physical.
Right.
The question is, though, what is physical, right?
Yeah.
And what does that really mean? And I would argue that we need to drop back and keep dropping back until we have a landscape broad and deep enough to make sense of all of these experiences. And again, when you look at the world as a rendering arising from consciousness rather than the other way around, you can fit all these things. In fact, I would say it's the only way you can fit all these things.
Totally. Yeah, and maybe it's again just a matter of a missing concept because for people like you and I who are oriented in the way that we're oriented, physical abduction does not need to occur for it to be real or for it to be very consequential. Like what if we just throw the idea of subtle bodies on top of this, koshas on top of this? Maybe these intelligences can interact on that kind of a level and take your non-physical aspects of self and take them, show them things, do things to them that make the physical aspect, the physical body, an afterthought, and it sounds maybe not satisfactory to people who haven't had a really undeniable experience of that sort of subtle body architecture being real. And I was one of those people up until about a year and a half ago. I did a Monroe Institute Gateway retreat. Even up until the last day of the retreat, I had felt the sensations that they were trying to evoke in your body of the energy. Um, but I did not think I would go out of body. And then it happened, and it was terrifying, undeniable. For people that haven't heard this story, which you're in the minority at this point because I've talked about it a lot on the show, but it is so real and so not metaphorical and not dreamlike when it happens to you and you're fully metacognating and you're aware of your physical body and you're aware of this peeling away and lifting off. If something would have come in that moment and took that aspect of me and did something, it would have been indistinguishable from physical reality. It's that real and that literal when it happens to you, or at least it can be. So, yeah, the idea that it needs to be physical or your physical body needs to be taken in a physical spaceship, I don't think that's true at all. And I do think a lot of these things could be happening on the subtle body level and probably are happening on the subtle body level. That really makes a lot of it easier to explain.
Well, I would say that I think one way that I make sense of it, and I would suggest we try to make sense of it, is that beyond the question of what layer of reality or what level of reality these things are arising from, at the very least, what I think you end up discovering, and we're beginning to see the beginnings of this in our own science, is that inevitably this external science becomes inner science at
Right.
some point. And I remember having this conversation with Bernardo actually, that the ultimate technology is consciousness based technology, that
Hmm.
it's a very kind of elementary kind of technology when you have to work with the existing rendering and can only, so you imagine a web page, and there's only so much you can do when you actually have to work with the elements that are rendering on the web page. But if you can tap into the source code and interject and intercept and work with that prior to the rendering, then you can make what looks like physical reality disappear. We have aspects of the lore, of course, where an entire wall will vanish and these grays will walk through. This happens all the time. Now, we tend to think about that from a physicalist lens, like, oh, that's amazing. They're taking the atoms and they're stretching them apart at such a
Right.
level that
Yeah.
you can walk between the space between the atoms. That may be happening sometimes, but it's makes more sense to me that they are actually working at the substrate level of that. And so, regardless of what level they're coming from, they would inevitably, as part of a more advanced scientific understanding, understand consciousness, be able to actually work with some of that substrate layer. And then when that happens, you get the Arthur C. Clarke statement, right? That any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. And that is happening. And furthermore, this is where it gets really interesting, because when you can basically space-time engineer, if you will, to use that term,
Hmm.
then you can be influencing, and this goes to Jacques Vallée's work around the control structure, the control system. You can steer the direction, the trajectory of a civilization, and it be completely oblivious to it, right? You have these outlier elements that people go, but what about that thing with those weird beings that came in? And um, but but that's what's so fascinating, is we not only are assuming this is what's foundationally real, but as long as we believe that, we're easily manipulated, I would say, for good or for bad. And so at the very least, I would say, regardless of what level these are coming from, and I think they're coming from different levels, this is something else that Ken Wilber really helped me understand years and years ago. He called it flatland, right? This tendency to collapse and conflate to everything being measurable surfaces, right? That's what physicalism is. And it denies all these other aspects. So, in a similar way, I think because these are outliers, people many times go, well, we've pretty much got reality figured out. So, what's the one little piece we need to add to make sense of gray aliens and pixies or fairies? But it may be that we have one piece of the pyramid and the rest is not even filled in yet, right? This again speaks to the ontological shock that will be involved in disclosure, and even the question of, to what degree can you even disclose
Yeah.
this? Because if there's nowhere for it to land and be integrated, be grokked, then even if you disclose the most fundamentally astounding things, it'll just pass through like water through a clenched fist.
Yeah, that's a great hinge point in the conversation because I think, I say this all the time as sort of a way to be countercultural, but I think the idea of catastrophic disclosure actually could be a lot more catastrophic and ontologically disorienting than a lot of people who are just your standard, like, we deserve the truth, tell us all the truths. I think it could be a lot worse than what we even have the ability to imagine. Again, on a mainstream level, like where we have a failure of imagination on a lot of the metaphysical points that we already discussed. I think we also have a failure of imagination on how crazy and horrific potentially disclosure could be. And there are a lot of avenues to and I don't want to sit here and like focus in on the horrors of disclosure because I'm not that much of a pessimist, honestly, but I'm also a realist in terms of what the possibilities could be and what some of the possibilities even seem to be fairly likely to me. And one of the avenues of exploration on this is another episode of yours I listened to, which is essentially about human origins and potential manipulation or seeding of humanity at some time in our really distant past. And I also have been talking about this a lot lately because I had Lavenda on the show. I've been getting deep into Lavenda's work, and he explores this from a pretty similar lens to you, I would say, a sort of like comparative, religious and theological and mythological lens. Um, so I'd love to transition into that and hear some of your thoughts on where you think the evidence points in terms of human origins and how this could lead into an incredibly insane kind of disclosure if anyone really does have this information.
Yeah, that is the X factor, I think, when it comes to disclosure, because the question not just is about who these others are and just fitting them into our existing pyramid of life, but real questions about who we are as a total, right? In terms of, how did the modern Homo sapien sapien come to be? And I remember also having this conversation with Bernardo, who tends to be pretty conservative about these things,
Hmm.
actually. But he made the point, as outlandish as it sounds, that we would be an engineered species. That's the more parsimonious answer. That's what he actually said. He said that, and again, he's not someone who likes leaping to those things. He will quickly distinguish himself from the kind of crazy UFO nuts.
Hmm.
In this particular case, he said he thinks that's the best answer based on how much of an outlier we are compared to the rest of the animal kingdom. We're just such a crazy outlier, and you can look back even statistically, and see that there is a certain leap in cognition that didn't seem to arise at a pace that would fit with evolutionary biology. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Of course, speaking of lavenda, you inevitably have this question around to what degree are, speaking of origins, or are religious texts and traditions also an evidence of the same phenomenon? I would suggest it is. And it becomes fascinating because even then it goes even steps further than that, I would say. And often when I'm speaking to a certain audience, I will sort of gauge the possibility space and know what I can safely push before I lose any ability for them to track, or they
Yeah.
just like kick me out of the house or whatever, or the room. Um, because on the one hand, I would say you can statistically see the fact that there are certain genetic structures that do correlate with anomalous cognition and anomalous experience. And that's, again, you look at the work of Gary Nolan, I would point people to his work, where he, for instance, this is famously what happened. He was examining both people who I think had been subject to like Havana syndrome. They'd had some sort of neurological damage done. And there was a bunch of people that also had their brain scans in there because they also had this weird way that their brain was manifesting. And first he had to do was sort out the ones that were actually damaged. And then he realized some are damaged and he passed those on to this other person. But he said, these other ones, though, it looks like damage. It's this white matter, right,
Hmm.
around the caudate putamen. And at first he thought that was sign of damage. But then he realized it was actually a whole bunch of additional connections. And this is also happening in a part of the brain that is responsible for intuition, which quickly bleeds into psi, basically. All
Yeah.
psi capacity, as much as we can track it, correlates to that part of the brain. And this also becomes fascinating because what I covered in that episode you're referring to is that there are other genetic traits that also correlate with anomalous cognition, and not even more recent, like I saw a gray alien, but also my great great granddad saw a pixie or a fairy or whatever
Hmm.
when they were
Hmm.
in Ireland. And this is in the data. So regardless of what it means something because it's in the data. Obviously, it's not that blue eyes and green eyes mean that you have these experiences or that blue eyes cause it, but it's some sort of correlation. But what I'm getting at here is that I think even then, when I've had these experiences outside the construct, and I'm transcending Darren and Darren's history, and even the notion of Darren, I have a sense of intention, which then registers at a certain level within space time as what would look like a genetic structure.
Hmm.
So we can, on the one hand, when you're mapping it within space-time, which again is an epiphenomenon, right? It's not the root. You can say, well, this person came from this lineage of people that trace back to Celtic areas, and sure enough, they had a lot of interesting experiences there,
Right.
and that's true. That's true of me on both sides of my family. But I think at a deeper level than that, prior to instantiation in the manifest realm, you have an intention that ends up being expressed and registered that way. And this gets even more complicated and I think fascinating because when I've been outside the construct, I realize that I can also remember an experience being part of like an oversoul
Yes.
that involves many different what have become different people in this world. And when we make decisions, even our sense of agency becomes fascinating because they now have scientific studies that demonstrate that when we think we're making a decision, we can see evidence physiologically in the somatic experience of the body. Someone knows that decision 3 seconds before they
Hmm.
cerebrally register that they're making a decision.
Yeah.
So this very much fits with a non-dual understanding that this arises in our awareness. It's not being chosen here, but it has to register as choice within the experience set that we're constrained in as a human being. So I've had both those experiences. I've had an intention that was held by this sort of oversoul, many people, what became many people, and it ends up being instantiated in my sense of agency, my sense of choice, and even the lineage I ultimately end up inhabiting. So it really, again, comes down to which level you want to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. This reminds me of two things. One is one of my favorite Greek words is synthemata, which means like symbol of something, essentially, or token of something. And there's this idea that the physical body is a synthemata of your soul. So it's essentially like you're just an emanation in the chain of something higher, as you're describing, whether that's an oversoul or Plotinus would say like the undescended self, like there's the descended self that's here and it's unbeknownst to it. attached to this higher, truer self that is non-physical, that is what we would think of as the soul or the undescended soul. And I think what you're saying makes so much sense with that kind of a metaphysical outlook, and that also again resonates with my own personal experiences of these things. But yeah, zooming in on some of these factors, man, it is kind of spooky because as you were going down the list, I told you before we were recording, like I have almost every single one of them. I'm left-handed, the blue eyes. My dad has red hair, which is another thing that you mentioned as part of the constellation of genetic factors. I even have like some red beard hairs and stuff like that. And I actually had blonde hair as like a up until I was probably about 3 or 4 years old, like straight blonde hair, and then somehow my hair went to wavy and brown. But anyway, and I'm not trying to say I'm the most psychic person in the world, but I do think that I'm sensitive to energy. I'm very prone to get swept up in music or art, or I would say vibes, or um, like I find my like when doing psychedelics. Also, I think I'm like very sensitive. Like I don't think I need high doses and I've taken high doses, and I think they affected me disproportionately stronger than a lot of other people that I've been with. So, it's things like that where it's easy to start connecting dots for sure. And you said you also have a lot of the traits yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, as I said to you, it's kind of like you start feeling like the cat chasing its own tail because as I started investigating that, I had every single one, literally every single one. And again, I would really point people to Ian McGilchrist's work. The Master and His Emissary is this massive book that he wrote in a really complex, nuanced way about the difference between the right and the left brain. And he will make the point that what we've done as a society, as a Western civilization, is we've marched more and more towards the left brain's understanding of the world, which tends to be all about separation, cutting things up and segmenting them and categorizing them as separate. And there's major consequences for that. In fact, sometimes in the classes I teach and whatnot, on the coaching I do, this is in some ways you could say the fundamental problem of the modern world in with the West dominating the planet is that we act as if things are separate,
Yeah,
but they're not ultimately. And whenever you act in a way that's not in accordance with ultimate reality, eventually bad things happen. And that's what we're seeing happen. And we kind of double down and just try to do more and more of it rather than recognizing maybe we're seeing it the wrong way. So when you actually look at the differences between the way the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, again, not just interpret the world, but render the world, right? This is the
yeah,
key distinction. And it is remarkably different, right? And again, the only way I think I would argue that you can make sense of the fact that not only do we perceive different things, but different things seem to manifest. It's not just about noticing different things. It's that some people seem to like have this alchemical aspect where, like I was saying about my ex-wife and I, when we were together, it seemed to create this alchemical effect in terms of what arose in our experience.
yeah,
So, and you mentioned synchronicity earlier. That's another one, right? That becomes really fascinating. And there's been so many times, and increasingly so, I would say, where I have this, like the hair on your arm stands on end
hmm,
because you have a sense of, wait a second, like this is not at all what we think it is. And speaking of what we were discussing before with the oversoul and the pre-incarnate self and all that, I would say even my sense of what we might call free will or agency has shifted, that I don't see myself as a separate thing acting amongst a bunch of other things. I see it more like what the way I exercise my free will is by attuning better to the arising that's happening within me. And I absolutely have the experience that is coming from somewhere beyond this, but I also don't supernaturalize that because in a
right.
way that's the most natural thing in the world. And again, once you make this shift, then you expect that these things will be the case.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go a little more down the rabbit hole of these potentially mysterious and thought-provoking ancient origins, because you mentioned you do have a background in religious philosophy or religious studies, and in one of your episodes of Point of Convergence, I think you do a great job of summarizing some of those stories, like from the Book of Enoch, from the Enuma Elish, maybe one or two others I don't recall that you went down the rabbit hole of. But why don't we start with Enoch? Because Enoch in particular has so many really evocative examples of what we're hinting at here.
Yeah, absolutely. And this becomes so interesting because, first of all, you have the whole ancient aliens kind of populist
Right.
kind of notion, right? That people are used to seeing on TV and whatnot, which, you know, doesn't aim to be really hyper accurate in what they talk about. And there's a lot of sensationalism around that entire movement. Um,
And still very
but
nuts and bolts most of the time.
it's still very nuts and bolts. Absolutely. They just try to replace gods with space aliens from Alpha
Yeah.
Centauri or whatever. Um, and this is, by the way, that's the part that's tricky, right? Is that it's not an either or. It's more like what we were saying, that you have refractions into ever denser layers. So it's like you shine a light through numerous panes of glass, and they're grimier as you go, and so less of the pure light is at the lowest level, but
Yeah.
it's still all arising and a reflection of the higher levels, as above so below, right? This is kind of the perspective here. um, but it's one thing to think about some of these ancient texts, which, let's just be clear what they're saying. They're making it clear that humankind was the product of some alien engineering, either from scratch or that they took some existing hominid on the planet and augmented them in some ways. Now, of course, some of these ancient scriptural texts will use really interesting mythopoetic language to describe it, but fundamentally we can look at it, what we might call today, as kind of genetic engineering is going on. And again, even then I would say, because there is a deeper energetic process prior to what looks like genetics, because again, space-time is just the rendering. So we have to reckon with the fact that we do seem to be an engineered species. All of us are hybrids in that sense. And then you get interesting questions around, and again, it's complex, it's controversial.
Yeah.
When you look at even power structures across the planet over time, this is something Lavenda gets into a lot. To what extent have those been established and put in place so they become the acting arm of some of these NHI? And to what extent do they maybe have some greater degree of genetic inheritance from some of those NHI, which give them an advantage because of how they can experience and understand reality to a deeper level? And then this is of course part of the conspiracy theories, quote unquote, that come up, is that, are some of these ancient royal lines and whatnot actually engineered,
Yeah.
and actually doing the work of some of these NHI who can be off stage and still control how things are unfolding? These are questions we will have to reckon with. And then what, on top of that, you get this description in these kinds of books around these entities, where again, sometimes we try to look at them as either make believe or spiritual, but it's hard to imagine them that they're just spiritual if they're having intercourse with female
Right.
humans and producing offspring, men of renown, these giants of old that are kind of described in these different texts,
Yeah.
and
Nephilim.
that they dominate the scene and they have certain capacities because of that. So what you do see, it seems like, among some of these ancient traditions, is that there's a plethora of what they might have called gods, small g, but really are these like advanced entities that maybe initially came in and might have even used this existing hominid or an augmented hominid as a kind of slave labor. But then, as often happens, you might have other groups that eventually want to liberate or empower those beings as well. So we see some of that happening too. And then this war of quote unquote heaven becomes these different groups disagreeing about what they should do with humankind. Now, that's one thing that we have to reckon with, which already, right, will blow many people away, and many people will not be ready for that. But then when you add to the picture that today people are being abducted on the planet and being taken up to supposed craft, and their reproductive genetic material is taken, ova and sperm, so that hybrids can continue to be made. And I have friends who, for instance, have had experiences of being introduced to hybrid children. And this becomes really interesting too, because when we kind of over spiritualize these things, we make it sound like it's this perfected process. But there is an awkwardness to this, because What happens is many of these abductees, when they met the first generation of hybrids, meaning that it's partly gray alien, partly human or whatever, they were failing to thrive. They seemed like a very sickly kind of being.
Mm.
But by the second generation, and by that I mean the second round where they had taken the genetics and mixed them together, created much more robust beings that seemed like an idealized version of a human being with a robust, strong body that can exist on this planet within this constraint regime, is what I would say, but also have greater psychic capacities that some of these other beings have. So this is something that we not only have to reckon with in terms of our ancient past and what we are as a species, but even what is continuing to happen, which, speaking of which, in genetic substrates, even something else I've looked into that many people are, nervous to look into, is to what degree is the explosion of neurodivergence and all of the anomalous cognition that arises with that also perhaps connected to this ongoing hybridization and augmentation of the human genome.
Man, yeah. That's a piece of disclosure I've never thought about. Like, yeah, we know maybe at least in part, like, yeah, it probably has something to do with chemicals and food additives and things going on in the environment, but some of it is also just like cowboy genetic manipulation on the part of NHIs that we have an agreement with to allow them to do. I mean, that would be insane. And I don't know how high your conviction levels are in any of this, or if you just feel like it's worth exploring because, these are stories that are replete within the lore of people having experiences like this. Um, and that's kind of where I sit is I don't know. Like I don't know what my conviction level is of any of this. But I do have to say, I do think it is pretty convenient for us to look at the most influential works of history and literature and say, nah, that they were just talking metaphorically when clearly it seems like there's a lot of agreements across cultures on the broad strokes of things. There's a lot of similarities that are too weird for all of these cultures have come up with independently of one another, I think. So you either have to say, oh yeah, actually there was contact amongst these disparate cultures, even though that some of them were literally living on different continents, or you have to make some kind of like weird Jungian sort of argument, which actually I don't think is that weird, that we all sort of participate in the same collective unconscious and we participate in the same sphere of ideas, which I think in and of itself actually makes it true in another way on another layer of reality potentially, which is also interesting. Or you have to really confront that there is some literal reality to this. There literally were higher beings in air quotes that came, or maybe not air quotes, I'll take the air quotes out, higher beings that came and manipulated something, like you said, that either was pre existing here on Earth or from the ground up, genetically engineered or psychically or magically engineered, alchemically engineered something that today became humans. And if you go there and you're willing to consider that what's being laid out in things like the Book of Enoch, like the Enuma Elish, could be real, not just that one detail, but other details, things get crazy very quickly. And the potential sort of sense making fallout from that is unending. And it's because it could imply things like, for instance, that we really are kind of a forgotten science experiment. We really are maybe just kind of like cattle that were left to roam after the zookeepers abandoned us or something like that. And again, these are levels of disclosure or potential disclosure that could get pretty crazy pretty quickly because they go to the heart of what people understand themselves to be, of what people think God is, all these giant questions that people often completely define themselves by could just be like totally obliterated.
Absolutely. But let me introduce something that I think is interesting and complicates it even a little bit further,
Yeah,
which I
let's go.
love
Yeah.
to do, right?
Of course.
Um, because I would also want to suggest to people, especially those who are feeling a bit nervous about this and they feel like they're victims of circumstance and our entire species might be an extension of that. I want to point out the example of, and I know numerous examples like this, and I'll share some of my own experience. But this one experiencer from Western Canada that I talked to and have discussed on my podcast, a guy named Jeff Selver, and what he experienced was recognizing not until, I think until his like late 40s, early 50s, did he even become aware that he was an abductee and that he had
Mm.
memories coming back from when he was a teenager, basically. But furthermore, he remembers being taken and up to a craft and them taking genetic material in a pretty mechanical way, just saying it bluntly, like causing with some sort of machine some sort of ejaculation which they then use to like create hybrids. And that seems mechanical, it seems cold and calculated to some people, seems inhuman. But what's also interesting is he points out that they were the ones that really turned him on to the exact metaphysical position we're describing.
Mm.
And furthermore, they would say to him that, and he also remembered this, was able to inhabit this memory, that he also at a higher level of these distributed layers of reality chose to enter into the experience of a human being. And if that means you're therefore under the constraints of an engineering experiment from another form of intelligence amongst these myriad layers, so be it. But his agency was still there, right? In other words, he was not just a victim of circumstance. And so I always want to point that out to people, because I think some people can feel pretty small in the midst of this kind of conversation, and think, well, then I'm just a lab rat, basically. But to the point we're making about we're all fractals of source consciousness, that's true of a rat too, right? It's true of
Yeah.
us, right? And so you can still at any point have this awakening, and you transcend the boundaries which are porous of what you experience yourself to be. So he points out that they basically would give little hints, they would seed things into his mind that made him go and study under a teacher that was teaching Advaita Vedanta, right? Like
Oh,
all these
wow.
non-dual traditions, he realized they were the ones putting him on that path. And they were also the ones doing this genetic engineering as well.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the things I had in my notes that you briefly mentioned, I think, in this episode, is you brought up Jim Semivan, who's a retired CIA agent who has sort of inserted himself into this disclosure conversation, this NHI conversation, and you alluded to him saying something about disclosure being more complicated than what people think. Do you remember what context he said that in, and do you have a sense of what he meant by that?
Yeah. So the word that he used on a friend of mine, James Iandoli's podcast, was that this would be indigestible to the masses.
Mm,
That's the term
mm,
he used. And then everyone, of course, it lit up, UFO X slash Twitter, and people were wondering, what did he possibly mean? This becomes an interesting conversation in itself, because I know, in fact, I've seen a lot of people that make the faulty assumption that some of the people at these deeper layers within government and whatnot know exactly what's going on. I don't think they do, actually. I think because of the same reason I talked about, I get into a room of these different UFO organizations that are working at a pretty high level. But because your starting points about what you think reality is different, and this data is ambiguous enough that without having common ground there, you don't know what to do with it. But what he was basically talking about was what you kind of were responding to earlier, or pointing out, which is that the sense making aspect of reality, right? So he, had a background, I think, as a Catholic. He definitely thinks about people he knows, and what do you do when the entire foundation of your religion, and maybe even your ethnic group, is tied to an origin story that is only part of the picture and is
yeah.
transcended by this deeper origin story. To what degree are human beings engineered, if you will, in such a way that they can handle that degree of ontological shock? It's I find it humorous when people say, "What's the big deal if the government exposes that space aliens are real?" Sure,
Right.
but that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? All of these other, pretty much every, I like to say, this is the one topic that leaves no other topic unscathed,
Mm,
because this changes our understanding of everything, right? Everything is downstream of this. So, how do you prepare for that? And really interestingly, also Hal Puthoff is another guy who was invited to this organization meeting where they basically were told, let's just say we have evidence that UFOs and NHI are real, and that it has consequences that go to the understanding of who we are and all that. We want you all to break up into small groups, these people that were invited into this room, different experts and whatnot from different fields, and come to your own conclusion as a group whether or not you are pro disclosure or anti disclosure. And interestingly, every single table came to anti disclosure. They just
I remember
they
that.
didn't think that the cost was worth it. They thought it would be too disruptive for society. And you get a bunch of disclosure warriors that say, "Come on, why should they get to know?" And I, I'm sympathetic to that to some degree, but I think you have to try to be human, and humane about how you want this to roll out. And when you think about how something like COVID is so disruptive to our world
Right.
order, what would this be like? And what kind of wars would unfold because different groups would say, for instance, forget this. This is demonic. There's even people within the U.S. government, a
Of
fairly large
course. Yeah.
contingent, right? Collins Elite and whatnot, who think that. So the truth is that human beings are remarkably incapable of adopting too much ontological shock. And most of the time, we double down on our existing paradigm for as long as we absolutely can. Hence why physicalism is still dragging on, even when the evidence points elsewhere. So I think this is something we have to think about. And from Semivan's point of view, and people didn't like it in the UFO community, but he's basically saying, I don't think you can disclose even what we do know about this and it be digestible by the masses.
Hmm. Yeah. And that doesn't even get into like more mundane realms, right? Like what could the economic shock be? What technologies could be unveiled in this that would completely nullify overnight large sections of the Western economy or the world's economy, right? Like if the energy system just changed like that, right? I mean, sounds great. We could all go to zero point energy, clean energy, but how many jobs would we lose? How many, whatever, whatever. And of course, those are band aids that need to be ripped off, maybe slowly, but not too slowly. But I guess it's not up to us. At least that one's not up to us. But another fascination I wanted to bring up to you directly because this is weirdly ongoing and it's probably something we're never going to have answers to is this disappearance of General McCaslin, who is this guy who oversaw um, Air Force technology and development or something like that. I don't remember his full title at Wright Patterson Air Force Base, which is supposed to be, ground zero potentially for um, reverse engineering and a whole bunch of UFO related chatter at the very least. And one thing we know from these WikiLeaks that came out in like, I don't remember what year it was actually. Was it like 2012 or 13? I'm not sure. But one of the things that came out is that McCaslin and Podesta were communicating with Tom DeLonge and Lavenda. And one of the two of them, but I'm pretty sure it was coming from McCaslin, emphasized that if they want to understand the phenomenon, they need to understand Prometheus. And I started trying to bring this up to Lavenda when I spoke with him, and I think we addressed it a little bit. But again, I think Enoch is a really good example of what they could have meant by that because there are all of these Promethean aspects to that story where you have these watchers, these angels that are or these beings, whatever however you want to think of them, that are charged with watching humanity or monitoring humanity or something, doing things they're not supposed to do, interacting at levels they're not supposed to interact on. And I could give a few examples, but I'm sure you know the story better than I do. So if you want to share some thoughts on that, I think it would be fascinating.
Well, yeah, and I think that as the days go on and he's not found, it becomes
Yeah.
increasingly consequential. And I think even mainstream media is beginning to catch on and sort of put two and two together. Yeah, but to outline what you basically described there, there was the sense that at first we didn't know who it was, right? Tom DeLonge was talking about he was in contact or was claiming to be in contact with these high level officials within the US government, the US military, that basically had made an agreement with him that he would be the front person to expose this to a younger audience, a younger generation. A lot of people found that hard to believe, but then lo and behold, the WikiLeaks happen and we get these leaked emails from Podesta. And sure enough, it mentions people like Tom DeLonge, McCaslin by name. Before then, he didn't want to name these people by name. He would just say a general, a high-ranking general. And
Right.
to your point, this is the like one of the most high-ranking generals. This is a guy who would know what is to be known. And the fact that it seems to comport with what Tom DeLonge was saying is certainly fascinating. Now, fast forward many years from when TTSA was doing its thing, and you suddenly have, for instance, the president of our country now
Yeah.
suggesting that he's going to declassify all these documents. Now, if you're part of the gatekeeping program and you think that that could potentially be imminent, then you want to think about your exposure, like your criminal exposure, because so much of this comes down to things that have happened, not just character assassination, but literal assassination of people, which again makes us wonder what's going on with McCaslin. So you can't help but wonder, has he perhaps been scooped up by the gatekeepers as damage control because they know that he has a history of wanting to help this be disclosed to the public through someone like DeLong, and they might just think that's a risk they can't risk taking, and so they might have taken him out. And he's not the only one. There are other people that seem to be working on really cutting edge engineering techniques
Yeah.
or technology that have also disappeared under strange circumstances. You get people like Congress people even now saying, just to be clear, I am not suicidal.
Yeah.
And they're saying that on social media because the concern is it's going to be framed to look like suicide. And as much as people initially thought, well, McCaslin is a senior now, he's retired, maybe he just had a mental episode, a senior episode. But people have pointed out, no, he was in sound mind, and it's one thing if it's like 1 or 2 days on that he's been missing, but now it's like a couple weeks that he's been gone, at least, maybe more. So to me, it starts seeming like, as strange as it sounds, maybe the most parsimonious answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just talking to Daniel Sheehan the other day. I had him on the podcast, and I want to say he told me that days before his disappearance or something, he had done some sort of big endurance race. So this is not a guy who was like old and feeble and just like doddering around and could have just fallen off a cliff really easily. Like very experienced outdoorsman and apparently like hiker and endurance racer and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to just jump to the most conspiratorial, clickbaity theories because it's fun. But really, I mean, it seems like a serious possibility. Like how can this guy just be out there totally off the leash, unsupervised? Not even like let's just remove the UFO stuff completely. He's a major general who was working up until I don't know when he retired exactly, but he's not that old. So clearly he still knows a lot of very operationally sensitive facts about what's going on. How this guy cannot have protection or eyes on him checking in with him regularly is pretty crazy, even from the most like mundane levels.
Yeah, and speaking of the fact that he was in good shape mentally and physically, even if he had some sort of accident where he fell off a cliff, I think he's lives near Albuquerque or something. They would have found him by now. They would have found his body, right? Like they've been looking. The FBI has been involved. There's been a concerted effort to find him. And if it's a conventional kind of mishap that he stumbled across, we would probably know by now. So. And on top of that, he seemed to be in good relationship with his wife and whatnot. So why would he voluntarily disappear with
Mhm.
vanish off the face of the earth without saying anything to anyone? And so people, yeah, speaking of conspiracies, opt either for the aliens took him, or the gatekeepers took him, right? And it doesn't seem like such a stretch. And as these things begin to happen, I think it helps remind us that for the gatekeepers, they're feeling the heat. Like this is something that does feel potentially like it's going to happen. As much as you and I both know that even last year, the year before, last several years, the idea that a U.S. president would make some sort of statement from a podium confirming NHI seemed pretty preposterous. Now it
Yeah.
doesn't seem that way at all. But it's also, ironically, and I always like to point this out, our political sphere is so incoherent, and the socio-political sphere is so incoherent, that even if he were to make some sort of statement, you have to ask how much purchase there would be, because we have such a divided society, and even what we appeal to as authority is so different. So how do you let this out in a way that will be grokked by the civilization? And furthermore, in a society that doesn't even agree on what's real, what
Right.
some people are anti-science, some people are pro-science, it'll be a huge mess. So
Yeah,
me, it just seems like what a strange and fascinating time to be alive.
yeah, man. Yeah, 100%. But returning to the Prometheus and Enoch sort of strain, what does it remind you of? Or what does it make you think about when you read that he was alluding to something like Prometheus, saying if you want to understand the phenomenon, you need to understand Prometheus?
Right. Well, and I think that another way that that DeLong has phrased it after those conversations is like the old gods never went away, is
Mm,
what he would
mm-hmm,
say. Right. So
mm-hmm,
it's this idea. What I take from it is related to what we were discussing before with these ancient scriptural texts describing interactions between non-human, but often humanoid beings and humanity at different phases. And you made a great point, and it's so true that uh, just the fact that there's this common ground amongst these different traditions around the planet that seemingly weren't interacting with each other in itself is a huge tell. But I think that what he's basically saying and what these generals were basically saying, and I've had some conversations with Carl Nell about this,
mm,
and I'll tell you that when you speak to Carl Nell about it, you obviously he's guarded about what he can say, but he will say that as himself being a person from a religious background, it's one thing when you think about this in a abstract way, but when you're presented with evidence that you know these things are real and they are like controlling things behind the scenes, that's a whole different
wow.
matter,
He
right?
said that?
And he is like he's taken up the charge to try to be the one to um, forge managed disclosure, right? Like he was the one who came up with the plan. It hasn't been working so well, but you know he does feel this on his conscience. And um, when you even watch his body language and his demeanor when
Mm-hmm.
he's talking about these things, it's someone who's burdened by something he deeply knows firsthand, and is trying to figure out how do we get from here to there? How do we get our society to begin to integrate this understanding?
So was this a sense you got from him, or was this something he said directly, like knowing certain things to be true and having to grapple with them, et cetera, et cetera? Are these things that he actually said, or is this sort of what you gathered from interacting with him?
So, for instance, there was actually, in addition to what he said to me, he has spoken publicly in a forum, I think, with Jesse Michaels and Diana
Mm,
Pasulka. He basically made that statement that it's one thing as a person of faith
mm.
to understand these things in an abstract sense, but when you are confronted with the reality and that it's intersecting with our world right now, that's a whole different degree of ontological shock. He has actually said that publicly.
Wow. So do you think that there are people like the Colonel Nels or McCaslins, or maybe even just like an unseen guardian group or majestic group or whatever? Do you think there's like a go between us and them, or do you think it's more diffuse and psychical, or something, or both, I guess?
Well, when you look at the lore, you certainly have incidents in history that point to definitely coordination and cooperation going on. For instance, there's people, for instance, who, and this is where it gets so interesting again about the genetic piece, because there's cases where someone will be recruited into the military. Later on, they look back and they go, "It sure seemed like I was being pushed into the military."
Yeah.
They end up in the military and they are quickly tested for certain capacities, which they demonstrate that they do have. And then they are put in a program where it runs in parallel to something that on paper they're doing. But secretly, what they're doing is, for instance, being trained on a computer
Yeah.
to move objects around with their mind. And once they have learned how to do that, they are eventually taken to a certain Air Force base. This is a group within the military, a certain elite group within the military, a very small need to know here. And to make a long story short, basically, they're taken to these trailers, put on a headset, and tune in telepathically and receive coordinates, what they took to be coordinates. They're basically numbers that were given to them that arrived in their mind, and then they're supposed to note down these coordinates and pass it up the chain to this certain group within the U.S. Air Force. And what they later gathered to be going on was that these numbers were referencing coordinates like latitude, longitude, dates, and times of when abductions were going to happen. So that suggested to him there was understanding, there was coordination, and that part of the agreement, because we've heard David Grush talk about accords, right? This is again pushes things even further. But the notion was there was some sort of agreement to the degree to where the US government, again, this would be another huge aspect of shock for disclosure, not only knowing that the US government knew about abductions while they tried to mock those people, but actually signed off on them, perhaps in exchange for some sort of technology. That certainly seems to be in the lore. I would say that that is part of what's been going on. Although, again, I want to point out, in light of everything we've been saying, there's many different kinds of intelligences and consciousnesses at different layers of reality. Some might be closer to a constrained rendering that we have, right? So, again, one of the really fascinating aspects that comes up is why the humanoid shape shows up over and over again. This doesn't fit with the physicalist notion of what
Yeah.
evolutionary biology would bring about in a different planet in some other solar system. So that begs even deeper questions about even prior to the engineering of humanity. Maybe that's why we have the humanoid shape, because we were made in their image, right? So it reframes these ancient religious texts, but it also even raises the specter of, at an even more ancient time, there was this cosmic seeding program of which the Greys and modern humans are derivative of. So the consequences go everywhere.
Yeah. Man, you're blowing my mind, and I think about this stuff all the time. So again, I want to follow up on what you're saying about sort of people who are recruited into the military and then they find themselves in these weird programs. We know, for instance, that this did happen with Project Stargate. Like that's all public now. A lot of those guys who are former remote viewers are public. I've talked to some of them. We know this goes on. We know these psi programs have existed at a minimum, and it seems insane to me to think that they don't still exist in some capacity. Um, One iteration of what you're talking about is like the Above Black story. The name of that guy is slipping my mind, but it's essentially exactly what you're describing. And he did a podcast with Jesse, maybe 6 months ago, and I found him to be so believable, like so just straightforward, and I don't know, man, just very believable, and not overblowing his story to any level where it started to just become too much. And he was very sort of self-deprecating and willing to admit when he didn't know something or felt like, I don't know, like he would hit these levels of, I don't know, man, like just like anybody who really had an experience that was kind of beyond the pale of everyday reality, that they don't have all the answers to, that they still have a lot of questions about. He really struck me as that kind of a person. Is this a program you're talking about, or is this just something
Yeah, yeah.
similar?
So
Okay, okay.
Dan Sherman is
Dan
is his
Sherman,
name, right?
yes,
And the subtitle of the book is Project Preserve Destiny, which is
yes.
it itself is a pretty leading title, right? And the piece I want to add that ties into earlier parts of our conversation is that his mom was an abductee,
Hmm.
and his understanding was that the aliens, right, genetically altered his DNA while he was still in his mother's womb.
Wow.
So she was abducted. They genetically engineered him for the precise purpose of being a go-between one day between the US military and the aliens, the Greys, or whatever
Wow.
that were doing the abducting. So not only are these pieces fascinating in themselves, but they begin to stitch together, right? You start saying, okay, there there is something to this genetic manipulation. There is something to there being coordination and cooperation amongst these different groups of NHI and humans. And we have people who have given testimony that is well supported. When you like look into his story, it's well supported. Another example that I could give you that I did a POC episode on was and the name of the book is Rachel's Eyes, and
Mhm.
it's this guy, again, similar story. He's recruited into the military, does some testing, quickly is put into a certain category of, this guy has certain psi capacities, certain capacities beyond the norm. He has one day job, but he has this other job that he's given, that he is taken to this remote part of the US Southwest. And there's actually a deep underground base. This is another aspect of the
Yeah,
lore, right?
totally.
And basically what he's tasked with doing is running a team that periodically these craft will come in, but they're coming in either interdimensionally or they're coming through a wormhole or some other layer of reality, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes that process doesn't go well and they crash. And this, of course, is also part of the lore that has
Mm,
been crash retrievals. So
mm,
he was tasked with, along with his team, recovering the craft so they could pass it on, and sometimes recovering bodies or see if people are still alive, the beings are still alive. And in his case, one time the only survivor of a craft was an adolescent hybrid. She was part gray, part human, and he adopted her as his adopted daughter, took her home to the Sacramento area, I think it was, because I know that she later on was actually put in the college system and went to a school that I used to go walking around when I lived in California.
oh wow.
And the reason the book's called Rachel's Eyes is because the one distinguishing feature that kind of stood out that she wasn't quite human was her eyes. So she would constantly wear these big sunglasses, according to the story. And in addition, she found a roommate. He found a roommate for her that was blind, right? So could never actually see Rachel full on, right? But she could have the social interaction. And I think Rachel also did most of her courses like remotely, right? So
Mm,
she wouldn't be out in public very often. But as the story goes, one point, the mother of the other girl, the roommate, comes and sees her without her glasses and kind of realizes, oh my gosh, this is not human. So again, these stories are part of the lore and they comport well with the evidence we see that's pretty well established.
yeah, yeah. What was so in your interactions with people like Nell or these other people who probably, if anyone has had contact or has been maybe not direct contact with information. People like Semivan too. I've actually heard Semivans into Neoplatonism, which is something I was like, whoa, that, I don't remember where I heard that, but I found that to be interesting and potentially telling. Do you have any idea what sort of ontological and metaphysical outlooks people like Nell have? Do they are they seem to be like on the level with you and I?
Well, yes, but with a caveat of so both people like Nell and Pasulka are coming from a Christian tradition, right? A
Okay.
Christian background, and Pasulka has more recently been more upfront about that. Still does inform her worldview.
Hmm.
So when I pay attention to all these different people, I'm noticing what way will they have a preference for framing information in a certain way, and especially when the information is ambiguous. Um, I think that both of them have, for the most part, found comfortable territory incorporating this within their general monotheistic tradition. So I know that again in that same forum I'm talking about that Jesse Michaels hosted that had Pasulka and Nell in, he would reference Pasulka's work quite a bit,
Yeah.
and also point to some of the stuff even Jesse had looked into around these deeper metaphysical traditions, and clearly was making the argument that what we stumble across in occult literature, right? What we stumble across in these different frames that see reality as physical arising from deeper layers that they might call spiritual, we might call mentation or whatever, mind at large. But he definitely was making the argument that this is the same conversation.
Yeah.
These ancient figures that we've considered spiritual entities are the very same entities that we're dealing with now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do know Jesse. We haven't hung out too many times. We've had a few. He's been on my show a couple of times, and we've been in social situations a couple of times. And I get that sense too that he's of that mind, but he's very open minded and willing to sort of change his mind depending on what the best, most recent evidence indicates. Like, and I was really impressed actually that we recorded one, I think in January, and he had come off a really successful video where he went down to Peru to see the mummies and was like very high on that experience and very high conviction. And then by the time we talked about it, he's like, yeah, I've totally changed my mind on that. I think that that's probably like my level of conviction has come way, way down. So he's very, I would say intellectually and uh ontologically flexible in what he thinks is going on. But I get the sense that he's sort of going in the same direction as you and I in terms of what he thinks the best explanation for the phenomena is. And I don't get how you can. Again, like circling back to the beginning of the conversation, I don't get how you can stick with anything simplistic or any one example or that or this hypothesis or that hypothesis alone being the best one. It really is a both and. It really does, I think, require almost like an integral theory kind of way of looking at reality. But where do you like if you had to guess, do you think we are going to get any kind of meaningful disclosure from this administration? And I guess the follow-up question is, to what level could they? What do you think if you had to read the tea leaves on what's going to happen with this, this most recent promise from Trump, for instance? What do you think is going to happen, if anything?
Well, the first thing I'd point out is that, ironically, as much as sort of the Trump group would see themselves as usually critical of government, they are still now representing government. And they have, we've heard, suggested that this disclosure would come through Arrow. Now,
Right.
this is while many people would make the argument, I think most people would make the argument that have looked at it legitimately and honestly, that Arrow looks like the extension arm of the gatekeeping program,
Right.
because they've largely seemingly taken whistleblowers, said, please come in, we want to hear your testimony. And then what these whistleblowers have testified to time and time again is that nothing actionable happens, and that if anything, it feels like they are taking this information so they can plug the leaks that caused the problem in the first place. So if the Trump administration or any element of government thinks they're going to go through anything that has to pass through the gatekeeping program, then you're again giving the reins to them. Now, that said, because I do know people in government and people who've been involved in these different things, I know that even within the legacy gatekeeping program, you have to remember it's like so old now that many people have inherited those positions. They weren't the original people
Right.
holding those positions, and so you do have an aspect of those people who do think disclosure is a good idea. They feel the burden of inheriting this information, and that's where this notion of managed disclosure comes from. Right? Don't wait until it catastrophically spills out. Do it in a way that you can control it to some degree. So I say that to point out that, the gatekeepers aren't one monolith either, right? But the problem is right now, first of all, that when they talk about disclosure happening, they want to go through the Pentagon or the DoD, right? Which, is again calling the pot calling the kettle black again. Now, even if they were to get cooperation, yes, to your point, the question is what could they disclose and how would people respond to it? I think that what's likely to happen is if there's any kind of disclosure, my sense is it's still going to be something that's ambiguous enough that it will not tip the scales on a civilization wide scale. I think that you'll have people who are already teetering towards this understanding that go, aha, there we go. But the skeptics will still say, well, it could be this, it could be that. Um, I think that even the people who want controlled disclosure, if they're part of that process, they want to see it happen in steps. And you can make an argument, and there again have been people who've told me that from 2010 on, there has been a shift in posture towards we
Mm.
have to begin to prep the American public about this and therefore the world population. And that in itself, by the way, raises questions of why now? Like if that
Yeah.
change in posture was made, why? That's related to this whole thing you've heard about with 2027.
Hmm.
Is something
Hmm.
coming and they want to get ahead of the curve? If they're moving towards disclosure, it's got to be because they think it's in their best interest, not because it's in the public's best interest. So all these things come to the foreground when we think about how this is going to pan out. I think if anything, we will have evidence that moves us closer to that. But not only will the evidence not tip the scale, but again, because of this pointing to metaphysical issues and people's interpretation of evidence is always shaped, often unconsciously, by their metaphysical position, you'll have 100 different reactions to the same evidence. So it's going to be interesting either way. And I think we're going to continue to move in that direction, but I don't see us having some catastrophic tipping point anytime soon.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there would really need to be a multidisciplinary think tank that had access to the full array of information where, kind of like you were saying, there are people like meetings that you've been to where you have, people like Avi Loeb or somebody who just wants to look at the hard facts, the radar data, whatever. And then you have these more academic thinkers and like Greipel or whoever, like they're talking about completely different things. Although maybe at the end of the day there would be some overlap in that Venn diagram. You would need like a budget and a whole team of people like that with full access to the information for there to ever be really meaningful disclosure. And then even that would probably include a lot of making inferences and guesses based on the smattering of evidence that we do have. Um, that is, unless there is direct contact that is ongoing with some branch of the government or guardian class that could come clean. But to that effect, there's one thing that Sheehan said to me in the interview that we just did that when I went back and edited it, I was like, I completely fucked it. I completely dropped the bone that I should have like clamped down on. And specifically what it was is he told me there's a group that he's calling the Association. And the Association is not the Legacy program. It's not Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon and those people, but it may be who is sort of orchestrating those people, is what I gathered. And he said this group that he's calling the Association will be public at some point soon. Yes, we've heard many promises like this in the past, of course, but that it consists of sort of maybe not a multidisciplinary panel in terms of expertise, but it's people from military, industrial complex, aerospace contractors, actual branches of the military, intelligence agencies, and they're all kind of on this side of at least some level of pro disclosure. And they seem to be the counterforce to the legacy program, keep it clamped down folks. So I totally did not push him as hard on that as I should have. But he did let fly who a couple of the people were. He didn't say their names, but he said they were, for instance, retired people who held this post and that post. And I think just from that information alone, you could probably figure out who they are, especially somebody like a UAP GERB or somebody who goes deep down these research rabbit holes could probably figure it out really quickly. So for anybody listening to this, this one will be out after that one. So I want to acknowledge I kind of messed that one up. I dropped the ball on that. But it was a crazy day. It was a very I don't know how it was for you with South by, but it was just sort of like a head spinning couple of days because it's like you're getting ready to do your South by talk, then you're hanging out all day. Then the very next morning, I'm doing this podcast with Sheehan, and I rented a podcast studio, and we were late, and you just have all these things going on. So I'm like looking at the time, knowing we only have this amount of time until they kick us out of the studio. And plus, it's Sheehan, so he's just overwhelming you with stories and people he knows and organizations he's been involved with. And yeah, so my head was just spinning in my defense, but I should have pushed him a lot harder on it. But yeah, I thought that association revelation was very interesting. And I'm very curious to see if we get more details on that in the coming, I don't know, hopefully months, but probably more likely years, if ever.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this, even amongst people that you think would be all on the same page and that have all been pro disclosure to some degree or another, who have come out of the military industrial complex. I'm not going to name names, but I'll say that there are people that you would think would be on the exactly same page and pushing the envelope in the same way, who inwardly don't trust each other. So
Yeah.
there's like movements and then movements behind those movements, right? And I think one thing that even I've had to like learn to be aware of is that something might look a certain way at the surface level, but there can be deeper convictions or reasons why an agenda people have to push a certain thing. And I think you want to do deep analysis of people's background and how they might benefit one way or another from disclosure beyond just what it does for the public being aware of these things. And that's been interesting to me that I've seen people who you would think would be on the same page that are actually not, and almost are warily watching each other as things proceed,
Hmm.
which suggests there's definitely more than one tip of the sphere. Let me say that.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. That makes sense. This has been fantastic, man. This is exactly the kind of conversation I love to have. You've been able to not only hang, but exceed me in a lot of these areas that I love to explore. So this is just such a rare conversation to be able to have, and I really thank you for doing it, man. And we should definitely keep in touch and do this again.
Totally. I've really enjoyed it too. I mean, going in these directions and inevitably getting into the metaphysical underpinnings is where you have to go, I think. So, been thoroughly enjoyable. And yeah, let's keep in touch and do more of it in the future.
Yeah, sounds good, man. And tell people about your shows too.
Yeah, so I have two podcasts, but they are both found under the same podcast name. So if you look up Exo Academian, you will find my Liminal Frames and Point of Convergence podcast. So they're both published under Exo Academian. So you go to the podcast platforms, find that there under Exo Academian. Same thing with YouTube /Exo Academian. Both podcasts there. I also teach classes on these metaphysical matters and consciousness expansion in general. And you can find information about that at essenceofbeing.info. And I think that covers it.
I got to look into the latter myself. It sounds fascinating. I'm gonna have to poke at you for some of your private protocols when we're off the air too.
Yeah, man. I mean, I'm pretty adamant about not giving specifics because if I don't make it like an absolute, there's always someone says, "Well, you
Mhm.
probably told somebody, right?" So,
Yeah, yeah.
but you're right that also what you said before that you can do some research and figure out what is the general parameters of what you can push and what you can play with, what you can leverage. So it's the combination of things that are unique, and that might be partly tuned to my particular way I am, but like you say, there's ways that people can look into what they can try, and that's what I find so fascinating is that as much as we operate under the default mode, we totally have the opportunity to go beyond that, and it's just a matter of choice, really.
Well said once again. And thank you for doing this, man. This has been seriously a pleasure.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it.